everyone. Welcome to Thompson Lecture today. It's our pleasure to have Dr. Andrew Dessler as our speaker today. Dr. Andrew Dessler is a climate scientist and professor in the Department of Atmospheric Science at Texas A&M. He's received his PhD degree from Harvard University in 1994. And his research areas are atmospheric chemistry, climate change, and climate change policy. Dr. Dessler served as a senior policy analyst in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in 2000. Andy is also well known as a spokesman, public spokesman. He was named a Google Communication Fellow last year. Yesterday, Andy gave us a talk about cloud feedback, and today he's going to give us a talk in a whole different area, and he's going to tell us the alternative reality of climate skeptics. So let's hear it.
So I think I'm mic'd. So thank you very much for the introduction. Let me say I realize it is snowing outside, so I hope you don't conclude everything I say is bunk. All right, so I'm going to talk about the political debate or the public debate on climate change, and I'm going to talk about this alternate reality that you have a choice. You can choose, reality of the climate scientists, or you can choose this alternate reality that's presented by think tanks and other groups. That's what I'm basically going to talk about today. And so I always like to start my talk out with Star Trek. All good stories start with Star Trek. And so you have Kirk, and he beams down to the planet, and he meets a green alien, and there's some smooching and other stuff. And then something happens, and there's this one episode, Mirror Mirror. I guess I'm displaying that I'm a nerd. I know Star Trek episode names. So Mirror Mirror, where there's a transporter accident on the way back, and Kirk. This is the real Kirk. He beams into this alternate reality where Spock has a beard. And Spock is almost exactly the same Spock as the real Spock, but he's evil. But he's otherwise exactly like Spock. He's sort of logical, but logical in a really evil way. And he enjoys tormenting people. And essentially, this is sort of the metaphor that I'm going to use here about people that oppose action on climate change have made this effort to produce this alternate reality. And the alternate reality is almost like real reality, but it's got a beard. And so that's basically the point is. Now, for this audience, I don't feel the need to really belabor this point. I like to always start out with what are the things that we think we know about climate. And I'll go through this very quickly. We know the Earth is warmed about 3/4 of a degree Celsius. The IPCC calls this unequivocal, beyond doubt. I think that's pretty well accepted. Even almost all the skeptics agree the Earth is warming, but not all of them. Most of the warming the last 50 years is very likely due to human activities, so we have our foot on the gas. We're now in control of the climate. Likely warming during the 21st century will be a few degrees Celsius, and a few degrees Celsius change in the global average can really remake the surface of the planet. So even your intuition is based on local changes. You say, well, today in Boulder, it's a lot colder than it was yesterday, but the global average temperature does not change very much. And when it does, a few degrees, that corresponds to big changes in the planet. And so the impacts of this are possibly severe. And so the question, though, is, who believes this? Well, the way I evaluate this is I go to meetings. And you go to meetings and you hear talks, you go to the AGU meeting. Essentially, nobody contradicts this. The research is on stuff like, how do we reduce the uncertainty in this? It's not, is this wrong? Is it zero? Nobody argues the warming of next century is going to be zero. It's how do we reduce the uncertainty? What is the climate sensitivity? Those are the debates. What are the impacts? Things like that, quantifying exactly how much. Instead of saying most, is it 80%? Is it 70%? Those are the kind of debates you hear. It's not a debate over these points. Essentially, you go to an AGU meeting, everybody accepts this. That's how I determine it. But people have tried to do more quantitative assessments. And so here's an example of one by Andreg et al. Stephen Schneider was a co-author. And essentially what they did is they looked through a bunch of papers that were written, and they got a list of authors who wrote papers on climate change, and they came up with this number that 97% of the experts agree with the IPCC. And again, I don't know if 97% is exactly right. I don't really know about their methodology, but I know that this agrees with my own personal experience about going to meetings on climate change. You go to meetings on climate change, everybody agrees. Maybe one or two people secretly don't, but they're not saying it if they don't. And so what's the problem? So this creates a big problem for people who oppose action on climate change. And the people that do these policy analyses are very sophisticated. They do focus group testing, they do polling, they find out if we want to do this, what do we have to convince them? If we want to sell ice to the Eskimos, what do we have to convince the Eskimos is true? And so these people have said, if we want to stop policy, what do we have to do? And you can look at documents that have been released on the web. So this is a memo by someone named Frank Luntz. Has anybody ever heard of Luntz? Yeah. All right. So a few people. So he's sort of, the most powerful person you've never heard of, probably. So he does these focus group tests, and he says, how do we sell people on these ideas? So he's the guy who came up with the way to get rid of the estate tax. So the estate tax is if you're very rich and you die, your estate gets taxed before it gets inherited. So does anybody know how he got rid of it?
Yeah, tax.
Very good. He called it the death tax. He said that one change, he says, estate tax is, nobody opposes the estate tax. But if you call it a death tax, all of a sudden everybody opposes it. Who wants to get taxed when they die? I don't. And so by simply changing the terminology to death tax, he was able to essentially muster enough votes in Congress to get rid of the estate tax. And so he's done this very careful polling on how do you win the global climate change debate. Well, he says very concretely, the scientific debate remains open. Voters believe there's no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. And this is basically why they have to create this alternate reality. They have to convince people that what we know, what we study every day, what we are pretty confident is true, actually is not true. And so there was a front line on 2 days ago, and this is the script from it. And so Myron Ebell works at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So this is one of the groups that most opposes action on climate change. He says, we felt that, and this is just on 2 days ago, we felt that if you concede the science is settled, and there's a consensus, you cannot, the moral high ground has been ceded to the alarmists. And this doesn't really make any sense. Why does that concede the moral high ground? But what he means is, if you concede the science is settled, you lose the policy debate. That's basically what he's saying. And so you essentially have to, you have to go to work and break down this consensus. Then, of course, you can't say, well, we want to win the policy debate, so we have to attack the scientists. You say, yeah, but we don't believe the consensus. We're lawyers. We've looked at the data. We don't believe that scientific mumbo jumbo. And so if you want to create an alternate reality, as these people want to do, what's the thing to do? So the first step is you have to redefine what you mean as an expert. So we have a pretty good idea of what experts mean. This is a definition off Google: expert, skill or knowledge in a particular field. I don't really like the way they defined expertise and used expert, but nonetheless, that's the definition. So, and we kind of know this. An expert is someone who knows a lot about something. If you want to be an expert witness in a court case, you have to be able to demonstrate recent relevant knowledge. You have to be, you'll go in front of you, and if you're not someone who actually works on it, the other lawyers are going to rip you to pieces. They'll say, why are you testifying? What evidence is there that you know what you're talking about? And so this is sort of the general definition of expert. But what the skeptics have managed to do, and it's sort of a theme that will come through this, is they've managed to redefine what expertise actually means. And essentially, anybody who agrees with them is an expert. And they come up with these post hoc reasons why someone is an expert. So if there's a chef or a chef who believes climate change is a hoax, they'll say, well, of course he's an expert. What do chefs do? They cook stuff. What is cooking? It's adding heat. What is global warming? It's heating stuff up. Therefore, if you're a chef, you obviously have the knowledge to evaluate climate change science, and that makes you an expert. And so, and so once you redefine, or actually, I'll get to that in a second. So what's an example of how they do this? So probably the example that most people, if you sort of read the blogs, is what they call the Global Warming Petition Project. And this is actually probably about 15 years old. But it's still, I'll show you, it's still cited. And essentially, it's a petition that anybody can sign, and you conclude that, I won't read this, but basically you think climate change is not real, it's not happening, it's not worth dealing with. And what do you need to have to sign it? So signatories are approved for inclusion if they have obtained a Bachelor of Science degree or higher in appropriate scientific field. And again, appropriate scientific fields is anything as long as you agree with them. And so, you know, and the argument here is that, well, if you have a degree in biology, well, there's lots of life on the surface of the planet. Therefore, you understand a lot about how the Earth works. If you have a PhD in chemistry or a bachelor's degree in chemistry, well, you know, what goes on in the atmosphere? Well, chemistry does. So obviously, you are, you're qualified to make statements about climate change. On the other hand, this really turns on its head the idea of what expertise is. If you want to go see a doctor, you would not go see someone who has a Bachelor of Science degree in some related field. And I guarantee the people who put this petition together would not go see a doctor if all they had was a Bachelor of Science degree. If you had an architect, or if you were going to build a house, you would go get an architect. You would not get someone with a Bachelor of Science degree. You would not get me to design your house. You would be an idiot if you did that. Okay, so but nonetheless, these people are experts not because of any technical qualification, but because they are willing to sign the petition. That is how you define expertise in the climate science world. If you agree with me and you agree climate change is a hoax, then you are by definition an expert. And I'll skip this. I'll just say that there are people that are adding fake names to the petition. So Michael J. Fox, John Grisham, Spice Girls. There were pets added. And so this is the first part. The first part is you define expertise in terms of anybody who agrees with me as expert. And once you define it that way, then you can say quite accurately, there are lots of people who think climate change is lots of experts who think climate change is a hoax. And I'll show you a few more examples of that in a second. And then the other thing is, you take real experts, and this is sort of the coup de grace, the people who actually know about climate, you try to dismiss them. You say their expertise actually doesn't count. So what you want to do is find people who don't actually work on climate, who don't actually study the problem. You want to look at these other people who happen to all agree with me. So you'll hear, for example, they're in it for the money. And this is probably the funniest thing I've ever read. All aboard the climate gravy train. Atmospheric Earth and marine space science teachers earn considerably more than the average university teacher. They also work much less. You guys, how lazy can one room of people be? Anybody who works 1,400 hours and has a legitimate career in academics, I would like to shake your hand. And despite their workload, they pull down a huge amount of money. Astonishingly, only one other public sector profession, psychiatrist, pays better than climate science. So, we make more than CEOs, more than all these other areas. So, we're in it for the money. So you can't believe climate science because they're in it for the money. You have to believe these other people that actually don't study climate science, who happen to all agree with me. You get other arguments. You won't get tenure if they don't get along. We're socialists. We're immoral. Sort of climate scientists are immoral. This is probably the most famous thing. This was a billboard that was put up by this group, the Heartland Institute. And so you'll see more about the Heartland Institute as I go through the talk. But basically, you can't believe the experts. Look who else believes in climate change. Anybody who believes in climate change is sort of questionable moral character. They actually had a whole series of these that we're going to use, including Charles Manson, who believes in climate change. Osama bin Laden believed in climate change. Fidel Castro is a big believer. And then you'll find people who explicitly sort of connect environmentalism with Nazi atrocities. And so let me, I hope this works.
There's a long history of that. I mean, remember, the first third of the 20th century, the counterpart of environmentalism was eugenics. And it was regarded as a moral superiority issue. The people supporting it, George Bernard Shaw, Margaret Sanger, and so on, Theodore Roosevelt, all felt it was a sign of their moral superiority. It became clear.
Enough of him. So that was Dick Lindzen, for those of you that didn't know that. And he's talking at the CEI, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, where Myron Ebell is. And essentially, you know, eugenics, that was what the Nazis practiced. So he's essentially saying, you know, environmentalists are Nazis. You know, that's essentially the argument he's making. So you can't believe them. They're immoral. They're socialists, and they're Nazis, and they're in it for the money, which I'm not sure all that fits together. And in fact, you can see people explicitly saying this. The largest threat to freedom, democracy, the market economy, and prosperity is no longer socialism. It is instead the ambitious, arrogant, and unscrupulous ideology of environmentalism. And in fact, if you've read Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt, she really thoroughly documents how when communism fell apart in the late 80s, the Cold Warriors who were fighting that essentially moved on to environmentalists. I mean, environmentalism became the new target of these, you know, that's the threat. That's the new threat. And so basically, you know, you come up with this thing, the experts can't be trusted. So we should listen to these, you know, these non-experts. So it's almost like the less you know, the more trustworthy your opinion is. And realize this goes against everything that we do as a society. We always listen to experts. You know, if you were in jail, you would call a lawyer. I'm pretty sure most people would. You know, if God forbid you think you have a serious disease, you go see a doctor. Not just any doctor, you go see someone who's an expert. And not just any expert, someone who's an expert exactly in that disease, and you want to get recommendations. You want someone with training, years of experience. You're not going to get somebody who you can make some tenuous connection. They might know something about the problem. And this is the way we deal with life, but this is one place they're asking you not to do that. And so you might say, okay, well, what's really, where does this go? Well, this is a brick. This idea, this nugget is sort of infrastructure, and it can be used then in the policy debate. So I will present my governor, Rick Perry. I am not afraid. And so he has to defend this. So reporters ask him, you know, why are you poo-pooing climate change? And so he can use, in response to our queries, this is the Washington Post, in response to our queries, Perry's spokesman, Mark Miner, sent us the link to something called the Petition Project, which claims to have collected the signatures of 31,000 American scientists. They're not scientists, although luckily the Post put it in quotes, on a petition that says there's no convincing scientific evidence, blah, blah, blah. And so basically this now, you can now use this. It's a soundbite. In a soundbite world, you don't drill down through the sound bites. You have talking heads. You say, well, this guy says there's a petition. These people say it's not. You get this argument, and people kind of tune out. So it actually becomes very effective. You can create these arguments. You can keep the idea that the science is settled, unsettled in the public's mind. Remember what Frank Luntz said? He said, as long as people think there's a debate, then you're fine. The skeptics don't have to win. They just have to run out the clock, basically. It's the fourth quarter. They can let you gain yards. They just have to kill the clock at this point. That's essentially what they're trying to do. And again, this is from the front line. So this is Fred Singer. So 97% of them, that was that Andrag et al. Paper I showed you from the PNAS. And one of you, it's like, well, you can put it that way, but I don't think that's the way it works. There's hundreds of us, hundreds, thousands. Look, 31,000 scientists and engineers signed a statement to the contrary. The Oregon petition, yes. So I mean, it's a soundbite. We live in a soundbite world, and the Oregon petition is a brick. It's a soundbite you can throw down anytime you want to introduce doubt. And so, you know, to sort of understand this fully, you have to go back to the granddaddy of scientific obfuscation, and that's the smoking case. And so this will kind of help fill in some of the gaps. So this is the cover of the 1964 report by the Surgeon General. And in it, they make extremely strong statements about whether smoking causes cancer. And don't try to read that. I'll just have a few quotes. So they say, cigarette smoking is associated with a 70% increase in the age-specific death rates of males, to a lesser extent with the increased death rate of females. They had less evidence for women, less studies of that. And then they go on and talk about emphysema. On the next page, they talk about heart disease. I mean, it's really, you read it and you think, yeah, you know, I would stop smoking if I read this, if I did smoke. And so you ask the question, and this is going to, again, just to give you the heads up, this is going to parallel the climate change debate. So you ask the question, what did the tobacco companies do? Did they say, okay, guys, we're convinced, we're going to try to convince people to stop smoking? They say, we're going to quit manufacturing cigarettes. Of course not. Luckily, because of litigation, there are all these memos, and so don't try to read this. This is a memo. You can get all of these online at UCSF. And essentially it says, we must, this is a response to that report, we must in the near future provide some answers which give smokers a psychological crutch and a self-rationale to keep smoking. These answers must also point up the weaknesses in the report. And so essentially, there's a tobacco playbook. And the climate skeptics are going through it page by page. And this idea of attacking the science goes back decades. It's very effective. Most people don't understand science. When they hear a bunch of scientists arguing, they just kind of tune out. They just say, oh, I don't know who to believe. I'm going to worry about something else. And so this goes back, but it's probably most explicitly discussed in this other memo by some colleague at Brown and Williamson, written in 1969. This is really a famous memo. Doubt is our product, since it's the best way of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the best way of establishing a controversy. So this idea of attacking the science as a way to prevent action on policy really does go back a long way. And again, I'll show you some parallels in a second, but let me show you a clip. This is 1982, Good Morning America. There are people in the room old enough to remember. So I show this to my undergrads. They have no idea. It's like, what? What? You had TV in 1982? And so this is, so 1982 was probably 30 years after it was really firmly established, maybe 25 years, that smoking caused cancer. This is 25 years after the longitudinal studies that showed that cancer was associated with all those health risks.
Yesterday, the government released a new report on smoking and health, which said that there is overwhelming evidence that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and is a major factor in heart disease. The tobacco industry says that there is no conclusive evidence that smoking causes cancer or heart disease. Yesterday, we discussed this new report with the United States Surgeon General, Julius Richmond, and John Pinney of Health, Education, and Welfare. And this morning, Bill Dwyer, who is Vice President of the Tobacco Institute, is with us, and Steve Bell joins our conversation from Washington. Good morning, Mr. Dwyer.
Good morning, David. Thank you very much.
But if everybody made the choice to quit smoking, then, of course, there wouldn't, let's say, be any more tobacco industry. So it's in the interest of the industry to keep people smoking if they're going to continue to make a profit. Why should the public believe you as opposed to believing the Surgeon General and all the doctors and the reports from the government?
David, I don't think it's quite so much a matter of believing us versus someone else. It's believing what the facts are. And the facts shouldn't all come from a single source. It isn't really just our statement of contradiction or difference with the Surgeon General. There are many independent men and women of science who don't believe that the causal conclusion yet has been reached. David, we don't deny that there is statistical evidence. Smokers in greater number than non-smokers do fall victim to these various diseases. But we must remember that, for example, most smokers don't develop lung cancer, and certain non-smokers do as well. We think it's an open question.
So if you sort of decompose the argument, so what's the doubt strategy that tobacco is running here? The facts aren't all in. You know, we don't know everything about it. You know, you never know everything about a problem. You could always say the facts aren't. We don't understand gravity completely. The facts aren't all in on it, but you know, we still understand it pretty well. Experts disagree, and that was completely false. I mean, there was essentially uniform agreement in the scientific community in the 80s among the relevant experts that smoking was associated with these health risks. And it had been true for 30 years. We don't deny, and then there's sort of a more sophisticated argument, we don't deny that smokers get lung cancer more frequently, just like, well, we don't deny the earth is warming, but some smokers don't get lung cancer, and some non-smokers do. And I won't go into all sort of the parallels, but you know, they're sort of exactly the same kind of obfuscation arguments. You know, it's like, well, you know, we don't disagree it's warming, but, you know, the climate's been changing forever. The climate 55 million years ago was warmer, you know, where the dinosaurs driving SUVs. And that's essentially exactly the same argument here. And so again, Heartland Institute, we'll keep hearing about Heartland. So they're one of the biggest sort of purveyors of doubt out there. They put out a press release before the front line was on Tuesday. Anyone see that, by the way? So it was actually a good show. Not just because I'm in it. So the front line was on Tuesday, and before that, they put out a press release to try to pre-bunk. And they say there is no science, and they're basically just going through the playbook. It's a tobacco strategy. It's a Luntz memo. There is no scientific consensus about how much the planet is warmed. And then, you know, the best scientific data show there has been no warming for 16 years. And, I won't go into all of this. And so, this is part of the alternative reality, but it goes deeper than that. And there's actually a lot of other parts. So let me sort of go over some of the other parts of the alternate reality that you very well might run into if you go talk to the public or if you read the blogs or anything like that. Okay, so most people have seen this IPCC report. The fourth assessment report came out in February of 2007, won the Nobel Peace Prize. And in fact, there are other authoritative reports. The National Academy of Sciences seems to put out another report about every month. This is Advancing the Science of Climate Change. Quite a good report, actually, I think. They did a nice job. CCSP puts out lots of reports. Again, I think every few weeks another one seems to come out. And you go across the pond, UK Royal Society puts out reports. So even if you don't believe the IPCC report, there are lots of other assessment reports to believe. But, and so the people constructing the alternate reality have to respond to this. They have to do something. And so an example of what they've done is they put out their own report. So this is the NIPCC, what my father calls the nitpick, which I think is pretty good. I give him a lot of credit for that. Climate Change Reconsidered. So essentially Fred Singer wrote this, and of course it's, you can't really see here, it's published by the Heartland Institute. And essentially it's their own response to the IPCC. So if you don't want to believe the IPCC report, if someone tells you, what about the IPCC report? You can say, and you don't want to believe climate change, you can say, hell, I have this report. Just like if somebody says there's a consensus of scientists, you can say, well, I have the Oregon Petition. So everything that you have, if you accept mainstream science, everything you have, they have something that they can say, well, what about this? And you could argue, you could say, well, it's not as good a report, and so we can kind of talk about that. So if you look at the IPCC, that's Spock without the beard. It's the process that gives the IPCC its credibility. It's the fact that it's written by scientists, by actual experts. Then it goes through multiple layers of review. It goes to a public review, goes to an expert review, goes to a government review. It summarizes the peer-reviewed literature. It's put together. Lots of people hate the UN. But, it's put together by, I think, a group that, lots of people would say they are an organization trying to take over the world. But there's a process. There's actually a process that goes into this. And the result is a report that I think is really a good summary of what we know and how confidently we know it. Are there mistakes in it? Sure. They got the amount of land in the Netherlands above sea level wrong, and there was a mistake in the glaciers. But it's a 3,000-page report. It would be surprising if there weren't any mistakes in there. If you look at the main conclusions, those were all correct. And again, so we can look at the nitpick, and that's Spock with a beard. And essentially, it's not formed by a credible process. When you look at these reports, you don't look at the report, you look at the process that formed it. Because if you're not an expert, then you can't look at the report and tell if it's bogus or not. And so the only thing you can really do is look at the process. Essentially, it's written by skeptics. It has a very small writing group. In fact, I saw an email from Fred Singer, and I'm kicking myself for not keeping it. And it was basically saying, if you want to be listed as an author or reviewer, send me an email. And so you didn't actually have to write it to be on the author list. You didn't actually have to review it to be on the author list. You could have just sent him an email saying, yeah, please add me to the author list. It didn't go through review that I know of. And it's essentially infrastructure for alternate reality. And the Heartland Institute put it out. And so what's a more recent example of this? Okay, so this is a report from the CCSP, 2009, Global Climate Change Impacts in the United States. This is a report put out by the Cato Institute, which is another libertarian think tank. And these, you'd be correct if you said these looked a lot like each other. And so these two things completely contradict each other. This says climate change has got serious impacts. This says, oh no, warmer temperatures mean tank tops and barbecues, and who doesn't like wearing a tank top? And so and you see really absurd arguments like Pat Michaels said in an interview that this has 1,800 references in it. This has 900 references in it. Therefore, you could argue that they left half the relevant science out. Things that are really crazy. But again, it's infrastructure. It allows you to say, if somebody says, well, what about this report? You can say, well, I have this report. I have this report that says that report's bunk. All right, so what's another example? So we have the AGU meeting. So I assume most people here have been to the AGU meetings. They are mammoth. 20,000 people at the last AGU meeting. And they're basically mostly PhDs. There are some students there. but the majority of people are PhD scientists that are actually working in geoscience. So of course, the skeptics can't let a giant international meeting go unanswered. And so the Heartland Institute has their international conference on climate change. And there's a hilarious article in the New York Times in 2008. And the last paragraph said several hundred people, so instead of 20,000 people, you have a few hundred people, sat in the fifth floor ballroom Marriott, trying hard to prove they had unraveled the established science showing that humans are warming the world in potentially disruptive ways. The meeting was largely framed around science, but after the luncheon, when an organizer made an announcement asking all the scientists to move to the front of the group for a group picture, 19 men, old white men, did so. And basically, and so, again, if you say AGU meeting, people can say, but we have a scientific meeting of our own. And our scientific meeting is as good as your scientific meeting. But again, this meeting is full of experts, but only experts in the sense that they agree with me. They're not experts in the sense that they actually know anything. And I guarantee you, I've talked to people that go to these meetings, they don't understand any climate science. I mean, all they are is really afraid of cap and trade and carbon tax. Okay, here's one thing. So here's a letter that was sent to a bunch of senators a few years ago by all of these scientific organizations, AGU, ACS, AAAS, AMS, American Physical Society is on here somewhere. Maybe it got cut off. And basically showing you the same arguments, the same points I showed you. The Earth is warming, it's caused by humans, it's potentially significant. And so scientific organizations have been actually very supportive. I mean, even the American Association of Petroleum Geologists cannot bring themselves to say they don't believe in climate change. They do say we need a lot more research, fair enough. But through gritted teeth, they even acknowledge the problem is that there is a potential problem out there. So essentially, all the scientific organizations agree. And again, you can't let this stand if you're a skeptic. So you have to come up with your own scientific organization. This is so there's a scientific organization, Principia Scientific International, and it's put together by a bunch of people who don't believe in the second law of thermodynamics. So they don't think the greenhouse effect actually exists. And it's the world's first practicable alternative for scientists and members of existing national science associations who feel let down by what appears to be a culture of politicized science. It's code word for believes mainstream science. So if you believe mainstream science, they'll say, well, you're politicized. You're just going for some social redistribution. And so again, if you say, well, I have all these scientific statements from organizations, they'll say, yeah, but look, there's this scientific organization, and they don't agree. So again, it's something tit for tat that you can use to contradict this thing. And but in reality, there are really very few legitimate skeptics, and the people that you see out front are very rare in number. And the thing that's kind of struck me as someone who's worked on stratospheric ozone depletion and climate change is not only are there not very many of them, but they're the same people over and over. So if you go to the Heartland, so remember the Heartland Institute, I've mentioned them many times. They put out the nitpick. They do the scientific meeting. They were on the front line opposing, pushing doubt on tobacco smoke. If we go to Fred Singer, so Fred Singer on secondhand smoke, don't read this, it will give you indigestion. But we just say he doesn't believe the science connecting smoking and health effects is robust. And Fred doesn't believe in acid rain. And Fred doesn't believe in nuclear winter. And Fred doesn't believe in ozone depletion. And Fred, of course, doesn't believe in climate change. And if you look at it, there's a small number of people. Pat Michaels, the guy that wrote the Cato Institute, he didn't believe in ozone depletion, which are essentially endlessly recycled. And these people use the infrastructure of doubt to push this idea that we don't really know a lot about climate. So I'll sort of wrap up with an example. So this is an example of how it works. All right, so we start off with a Roy Spencer paper. So Roy, for those of you that don't know Roy, he does not think humans are having much of an influence on climate change. He's one of the very few, though, actual credentialed atmospheric scientists. So, he writes papers on atmospheric science. He does remote sensing. So he actually is, he and Lindzen and maybe a few other people are the very small number of actual experts who disagree with the mainstream view. Okay, so if we look at this paper, he comes up with, this is the abstract. He says, it is not possible to accurately quantify this discrepancy, and that's between, I won't go into the details, but well, actually I won't worry about it. So go to the say. It is concluded that atmospheric feedback diagnosis of the climate system remains an unsolved problem due primarily to the inability to distinguish between forcing and feedback. So don't worry about what that says technically. The thing you want to see is, it is concluded that it's an unsolved problem. It is not possible to accurately quantify this discrepancy. So when he published it and he sent it into the reviewers, his message was there's uncertainty here, not that the things are wrong. And so that's step one. So you get the paper. And then you put out a press release. And the press release begins to diverge from what's in the paper. And that's because the press people will publish anything you say. I mean, you can tell them to, you can write a press release and send it to them, and they will put it out. So the Earth's atmosphere is apparently more efficient at releasing energy of space than models used to forecast climate change have been programmed to believe. The result is that climate forecasts are warming substantially faster than the atmosphere. Now, if you remember, in the abstract of the paper, he said this is an unsolved problem. It's impossible to quantify. So you get your first kind of divergence when you look at the press release. And then it gets picked up by the blog. So James Taylor works for Heartland Institute. And so he blogs, and he says, new NASA data blow gaping hole in global warming alarmism. So it's diverged more. And so now it's off completely disconnected from what's in the science paper, basically saying he's proven the models are wrong. He's proven that these estimates are wrong. And so what happens next? Okay, well, again, most people don't read this. You know, really the hardcore people read it. But what happens is this gets picked up. So this is another thing for Washington Post. Another Perry spokesman, Rick Perry, when he's running for president, provided links to a number of recent articles he said demonstrated skepticism in the scientific community. And he pointed to a blog, this is Roger Pilkey Sr.'s blog, which talks about the Spencer paper. And so, you know, the key is you get the paper published, and then it's like a game of telephone, where every time down the line it becomes to diverge a little bit more from reality. And you end up eventually with this argument that, you know, we don't understand anything about this. And so I'll finally conclude here with why. Why do you do it? And the answer is this. So this is a polling analysis by Tony Lazarowitz at Yale. And what they've done is they've kind of segmented the climate change, people's views on climate change into 6 different groups. So she lives in Boulder, drives a Prius, shops at Whole Foods. She's convinced climate change is a catastrophe. This guy, middle-aged, white, Republican, college-educated, he thinks climate change is a hoax. And then you have these people in the middle, sort of progressively, these people are disconnected. This person's sort of worried. This person is doubtful. And so they name these people. This is Dan, that's Alice. I can't remember what the other names are. Or they give them this poll. But the key thing is that if you are a Republican and you're running for Congress, or actually, let me step back a second. So each one of these groups make up about an equal amount, so about 15% of the population. So Dan is about 10 or 15% of the people out there sort of actively think climate change is a hoax. And if you are a Republican and you're running for Congress, he makes up probably 50% of the people that are going to be voting in the primary. So if you want to get elected, you have to have this guy in your back pocket. If you don't, you will lose. And that's why, you know, Gingrich is a smart guy. Romney's a smart guy. Romney went to Harvard, so he has to be pretty sensible. So those guys know the science is right. I mean, there's no question Gingrich knows the science is solid. No question Romney knows it. But they couldn't admit it, because if they did, Dan would have gone for somebody else. So he really controls the Republican nomination process. And that's why if you go to Congress and you survey Republicans, they don't like talking about climate change, but if you can get them to talk about it, they almost all uniformly dismiss it. It's because that's what you sort of have to say to keep your base in check. And what is it that worries Dan? Has he actually looked at the science and decided it's not right? No, it goes back to the same arguments. You know, it's an argument about government regulation. These people are afraid of cap and trade. They're afraid of a carbon tax. They view, you know, the old joke about watermelons. Environmentalists like watermelons. They're green on the outside, but they're red on the inside. These people view environmental regulations as a slippery slope to loss of freedom. And you can read that explicitly. You just read the literature they put out, and they always talk about freedom and things like that. And so, in fact, Roy Spencer really comes out and says this on his blog. He was answering a question about this. He says, I view my job a little bit like a legislator supported by a taxpayer to protect the interests of the taxpayer and to minimize the role of government. So if you want to know why Roy's the only person that can look at the data and see a negative feedback, this is why. It's because he has this political agenda. He wants to push for small government. And he's written books on economics of the outrages of big government. And essentially that's really where the debate comes down to. And so I'll just sort of sum up with this. Why create the alternate reality? It really has nothing to do with science. And as a result of that, scientific evidence has no impact on them. If you're talking to a Dan and you're trying to convince him by arguing about science, you will never convince him. Those people are, I think, to a large extent lost. What you really want to focus on are the people in the middle that are disengaged. No scientific, in fact, scientific evidence will cause those people to dig in more tightly because they feel threatened. And so there's a lot of cognitive evidence of that. And the alternate reality supports a segment of our society, the DANs, for which denying climate change has become a value. It's not about science. It's about your worldview. What's your view on government intervention in the markets? Someone this morning asked me, what can scientists do? And, I think to zeroth order, we've done all we can at this point. We've done the science. It's really up to the politicians to do stuff. I suppose if there's one thing scientists could do, I guess, is we go in a lab and grow a backbone for them. That's basically it. But I do think that it's important for scientists to go out and talk. So, even though it's really a political problem now, it's not a scientific problem. We can reduce the uncertainty, but that's not what's holding up. It's not uncertainty that's holding up the problem. It's the politics of it. So we can go out and we can talk to people. And so if you get invited to give a talk to a Rotary Club, you should go and you should do it. You should give talks about this stuff. That's what we can do. But the problem is now a political problem, and they sort of have to deal with this segmented society and sort of try to figure out how do you build a coalition of people who are willing to accept that this is a problem. That's all in there, and I'd be happy to answer some questions. Thanks.
So any questions for Andy?
Back corner.
Hi, thanks for that great talk. You and many others have compared this with the discussions over tobacco, but in the tobacco case, it seems like the industry lost. I'm kind of wondering what the difference is in this case.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first I would say, as the long answer to that, you should read Naomi Oreskes' book, where she really thoroughly documents the tobacco and that. So it's a great read. So Merchants of Doubt by Oreskes and Conway. The short answer is it took 50 years to beat the tobacco companies. So assuming, if you want to use Jim Hanson's 1988 testimony as the beginning, just pick a starting point. You add 50 years to that, that's 2030. I'm pretty sure we'll have won the debate, the scientific debate, by 2030. And so, the short answer is that's one difference. And the question is, can we win the debate any longer? Because every year you wait means you have more committed warming into the problem. Yeah, we should alternate it so that the questions come and make this people alternate the sides of the room.
I also thank you. Are you familiar with George Lakoff, The Political Mind?
The name's familiar, but I'm not 100% familiar with what he said or that argument.
I recommend him. The original book was fluffy writing for the lay public, but it is about the neurology of repeated associations, which I think is fundamental in the explanation of how these values are loaded onto what ought to be supposedly logical thinking. The logical parts of human beings are relatively small. We've trained ourselves in this room to make them a much bigger part than most of the world has.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I'd recommend to people that do want to go out and do a lot of outreach that there are books on rhetoric. So Joe Romm, who's a really, if you read the blogs, he's a well-known blogger at Climate Progress. He's written a book on rhetoric, and he emphasizes short words, repeat, repeat, repeat. And if you think about it, that's what politicians do That's what advertising does. They come up with these short snippets, junk science, just do it. What are these successful advertising slogans? Have it your way. So if you want to talk to people, you sort of have to adopt a different way of talking. If you're talking about radiative forcing, you're never going to convince anybody. But you have to use metaphors, you have to use short, you have to repeat. So I agree completely. There's a lot of cognitive research on that to support those ideas.
So how do you convince them that dealing with climate change does not conflict with their worldview when denying climate change has a value of billions of dollars fronted by the fossil fuels industry? How do we counter that?
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, there are a lot of smart people who are trying to figure out how to win the policy debate. I'm afraid that the Dans are actually lost, that you'll never actually convince them. There's no amount of science you can do it. Maybe if something sufficiently bad happens, the equivalent of an Antarctic ozone hole, you get this really dramatic shift. Maybe you'll bring them around. I think, though, that you don't need 100% of the people. You need, 55 or 60% to have a big majority and get through legislation. And so, you could focus in the middle. And the other thing I'll say is, politics changes fast. In 2007, Congress passed a bill outlawing incandescents and mandating essentially high efficiency lighting. And you think about that, that was 2007. George Bush signed it, a Republican, no, I guess it was a Democratic Congress. I'm not sure if the Senate was Democrat, but anyway, it passed. And you think about that today, it is inconceivable that a Republican House would pass a regulation banning incandescents. That's 5 years. So I think, this is the election that comes up very well might define the future. And so it may be that in 5 years, the sort of the uber libertarianism, which drives a lot of this, the Koch brother kind of libertarianism, that might be out of favor. So maybe time will help us. Maybe they're lost. I don't know. If I knew how to win the debate, I'd be probably somewhere else.
Could you comment on one of the reasons for the denial is avoiding taking care of the problem and addressing the problem, especially the economic aspects of it, and that's one of the reasons people just avoid getting into what to do, mitigating.
Yeah, okay, so I think there's a couple answers to that. And again, there's actually a surprising amount of good social science research on this. And there are things like the economy. When the economy goes down, people are a lot less worried about the planet in 100 years than they are about their own jobs. And so there's a lot of resonance to this idea that this is going to cost you your job, even though I don't think that's the case. That argument has a lot of resonance. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why people sort of do it. I think there's the value argument for sort of the Dans. Then there's sort of the middle of the road people who are just opposed to change in general. So it really varies widely on why people sort of just don't want. People talk about a finite worry pool. There's only so many things you can worry about. And so if you're worried about your kids and you're worried about your job and you're behind in your mortgage, you're just not going to worry about the environment. And so I do think a couple things happened that really drove climate denialism. One was healthcare, kind of this government takeover gave salience to the argument, and then the economy. And I think that without those two things, the skeptics would not have had the inroads and sort of public opinion they have had. And as time goes on, that may reverse itself. It may be that in 5 years we talk about this as the nadir, and that things improved. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think Rob had a question.
One point that I think you've glossed over a little bit is this idea. So as scientists, we have expertise, but our expertise is in fact quite narrow, right? We understand the science of climate change. It doesn't make us particularly well. We're not any more expert on policy than anybody else, and certainly not than the politicians. And so I feel like there's a little bit of a danger that we want to be cognizant of. So I, of course, respect Jim Hansen's ability to go say whatever he wants to say, and he makes powerful political statements. But it is, I think, legitimately confusing to people and legitimately concerning for people to see scientists, if we're going to claim that we have abstract, irrefutable knowledge, to then be going and making overtly political judgments about which we're not particularly well expert.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And you know, you open, so there are two answers to that. One is sort of the moral answer. And what I would say is, in defense of Jim Hansen, if you honestly believe that the world is going to end in 100 years, I don't know if he actually believes that or not, you should be chaining yourself to a bulldozer. I mean, you know, that's the kind of thing you should be doing. And because we're scientists doesn't mean we're not citizens. So we have not just a right, but sort of an obligation to enter the political process. Now, from a practical standpoint, you make an excellent point, that once you start talking about politics, the other side can paint you as an extremist. If you come out and you say, I believe in a carbon tax, they can say he's a socialist. You know, of course he finds that. Just like that's what I said about Roy Spencer. He says he views himself as keeping government regulations low. But I think that the evidence that he's the only one that sees that kind of confirms that idea. And then, you know, Lindzen before that, Lindzen honestly thinks that environmental regulations will lead to a new Holocaust. And he's obsessed with the Holocaust, and he thinks that that's the road. So you can kind of understand these very small number of outliers that way. And so you're right, from a policy standpoint, I don't know what the smart thing is. Practically, I focus on the science, and if someone asks me what I think about politics, I explicitly say, speaking as a citizen, I believe we should take action. I typically don't talk too much about policy. I think if you go out, you don't have to talk about policy. You can just stick to the science. And everybody who goes out and talks to the public has to figure out where they draw the line, how extreme they want to be. Do they want to chain themselves to a bulldozer? Do they just want to stick to the science? So my colleague Jerry North, he really only talks about science, and that's fine. I think if you just go out and talk about science is great if you do that. I can repeat the question, so go ahead.
They went after you too on this particular Misinformation Act, right? And I noticed that the APU meetings and all these workshops and maybe that box. I mean, I would be afraid that somebody will talk to me. That has just been a lot of
Right. So the question for those people watching online was, what do you do if they come after you with FOIA requests? And so I have had my email FOIA'd. The bottom line is, if you speak out a lot on climate change, you will get whacked. People will come after you. So what I do is I delete all my email. I have a few hundred messages on the server. I just don't save anything. And so they can FOIA my email all they want, and I just don't turn it. You know, I'll turn over all the emails, which is usually 0. Or a small number. Last time they FOIA'd me, I turned over a dozen or 2 dozen emails. The first time I turned over megabytes, and that's when I learned the lesson. So you know, if you speak out a lot, you will get whacked. But I think if you're careful about it, you don't need to hire a lawyer. You know, it's not that it's unmanageable. You sort of have to be smart about it. And if people say you're a criminal on the blogs, you just ignore it. I mean, you know, you can't, you know, that's part of, you know, I take the long view, and I sort of ask the question, 100 years, what are people going to think of us? And I think that if we don't stand up and say, this is what we think, they will be mad, rightfully so. So I'm willing to take a shot here and there from people that I don't respect in order to do what I think is the right thing for history. I mean, you know, maybe we're wrong, but I don't think that's very likely. I think in 50 years, they're going to look back on this and they're going to say the scientists nailed it. The IPCC was exactly right. You know, maybe the climate sensitivity will be 2.3, but maybe I don't think it's going to be 4.5. But you know, I think we're right, and I think we have to get out there, and I'm willing to suffer they're pretty minor consequences. I don't view them, so people shouldn't be afraid. You have to be smart. Be smart, in particular, be smart about your email. Know your FOIA laws. I don't know what NCAR's FOIA laws are, but I know the Texas laws very well.
Any other questions?
At Texas A&M and other universities, are there some efforts to make sure that anyone graduates from a U.S. college respects the process of wanting to understand, you know, the physical world, that will not tolerate, you know, sort of the way that discourse is happening here in Colorado? We're being it's daily aspects of all the political campaigns on television and whatnot. And I'm of the opinion, until society says this level of discussion, we have to do something better. I have doubts about where we're going to make progress. But at the college level, what's being done at Texas A&M that you know that people come out of there with some respect for, you know, the process of science to understand, et cetera?
Right. That's a good question. And certainly, if people were better educated, if everybody had a PhD in atmospheric science, we wouldn't be having this debate. And so the question is, what do we do for education? And so Texas A&M, like most universities, has what's called a distribution requirement. So students have to take science courses. They take 8 hours. Yeah, it's 8 hours. They have to take 8 hours of what's called Tier 1 and Tier 2 science. And in that, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board has requirements of what has to be in those classes. And that includes things like how science works and things like that. Now, is that effective? Is really on paper, the requirements are there. People should be learning about science. They should be exposed to science. Is it working? And the answer is, as I'm sure all of you guys know, students that want to avoid learning about science in any in-depth way, there's a good word of mouth about what classes to take that are easy and don't require a lot of work. And so, I don't have a good answer to that other than universities do what they can. At least we are doing, I think, what we can within the constraints of a big public university.
Any other questions? Okay, if you have questions later, you can sign up individual meetings with Andy on the wiki page, and Andy will have lunch together with postdocs at cafeteria, so all postdocs are welcome to join us. And let's thank Andy again.